This is an informational presentation on rising groundwater due to sea level rise, and Kelsey Ducklow, an environmental scientist with our sea level rise team. She's going to kick off this item and we'll introduce our guest speakers. Kelsey.
Thank you, Jack. Good morning, commissioners. As Jack said, this is an informational briefing about new research on the impacts of sea level rise, specifically new modeling information on how sea level rise will cause coastal groundwater tables to also rise. And Billy, I have a presentation if you can bring that up. You can just skip to the next slide. Thank you. It is well known that we expect sea levels to rise and impact our coastlines, but what is perhaps less commonly understood is that rising sea levels will cause the groundwater tables under our coastal communities to rise as well. In fact, it is predicted that sea level rise could eventually cause groundwater to rise so much in some places that it could emerge under our feet, essentially turning dry land into wetlands and standing water. As you know, we consider the impacts of sea level rise in commission work on a regular basis, including flooding and inundation, erosion, and shoreline retreat. Groundwater rise is included in hazard analyses as well, but the level of detail has often been limited because data isn't easily and widely available. Next slide. Fortunately for us, a team of scientists has developed a new statewide model on how groundwater is expected to respond to sea level rise, which will help us fill that data availability gap and integrate groundwater analysis more routinely into the regulatory and planning items that come before the Commission. We have invited some of this team to speak to you today and answer your questions, including Dr. Patrick Barnard, Research Director for the Climate Impacts and Coastal Processes team at USGS, Dr. Kevin Beefus, Assistant Professor in the Department of Geosciences at the University of Arkansas, Dr. Maya Hayden, Coastal Adaptation Program Leader at Point Blue Conservation Science, and Dr. Dan Hoover, an oceanographer at USGS. We are very excited to have them here to highlight this important topic. Next slide. As the team will discuss in greater detail, the new data set has been integrated into the Our Coast, Our Future web viewer, which allows users to examine the data on a user-friendly, interactive online map alongside data on shoreline flooding and erosion. Maya Hayden will give a demo of the website at the end of the presentation. Next slide. Lastly, before handing things over, I want to briefly note why rising groundwater is an important hazard to consider in the context of sea level rise adaptation planning. First, it can have a number of impacts on coastal resources and communities beyond just causing flooding. This includes damaging infrastructure like roads and buried utilities before water even rises to the surface, reducing the effectiveness of existing stormwater infrastructure, causing corrosion, mobilizing pollutants buried in the soil, and changing the risks and vulnerabilities associated with liquefaction. Rising groundwater can also impact whether adaptation strategies will be effective over time. Groundwater tables can extend inland of protective devices like seawalls, and if they rise enough, they can seep up through the ground to flood inland communities. While seawalls can stop or limit flooding from ocean waves, they cannot stop water from seeping up from below. Understanding the potential for these impacts will influence how we think about which adaptation strategies will be effective in certain places and for how long, and spur us to analyze new innovative adaptation options to use in sea level rise adaptation plans. With that, I will turn the presentation over to our guest speakers to tell us more about the data set, starting with Patrick Barnard. Maya Hayden has also provided a video that will be shown after the PowerPoint to give you all a close to live demonstration of the Our Coast, Our Future, and Cosmos tool. The team will also be available to answer your questions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Patrick.
Thank you, Kelsey. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we hear you.
Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks to Chair Padilla, Executive Director Ainsworth, the Commission and staff for the opportunity to address this forum. This is work that's been long in the works and been supported by numerous California state agencies, the California Natural Resources Agency, the Ocean Protection Council, the Coastal Conservancy, and the Coastal Commission. So we thank you all for the support, as well as USGS, and for all the feedback we've received over the years to really help sort of push this work forward and develop the products. The next slide, please.
Billy, there should be a different PowerPoint for Patrick Barnard.
Well, that's being pulled up. Just want to acknowledge co-authors, Kevin Beefus, who's our technical lead in the groundwater modeling, Maya Hayden, who's been leading the development of our CoStar Future tool, and Dan Hoover, who supported various aspects of this work. And we've been developing climate-driven coastal hazards research for about a decade now at USGS. And this picture kind of illustrates sort of this complex suite of hazards we have at the coast. We have rainfall hazards, we've got overwashing from storm-driven water levels on the beach side, we've got groundwater emergence on the landward side here in this coastal lagoon, and sometimes these all come together. But it's really critical to assess this confluence of hazards at the state level to understand the risks we face with rising seas. Next slide, please. I just wanted to ground us in the latest climate science that's come out from the World Meteorological Organization, also AR6, which is just on the streets. And so in the upper right is a figure showing global temperature increases over the last 175 years. And regardless of what organization, what meteorological organization you look to, the trend is the same. Global temperatures are increasing, they're increasing more rapidly. In fact, the past 6 years have been the 6 warmest years on record. This is a statistical impossibility simply by chance. Global surface temperatures have increased faster since 1970 than in any other 50-year period over at least the last 2,000 years. This is a very, very conservative sort of statement. It's probably many, many more thousands of years than that. And global temperature increases drive sea level rise, and the rate of sea level rise has tripled since 1971, currently about 4 millimeters per year. And also sea level rise has risen faster since 1900 than over any preceding century in at least the last 3,000 years. Again, this is AR6, it's a very conservative body. It's likely many more thousands of years than that. But to keep in mind also, we often argue about sea level rise projections by the end of the century. But this strong statement from AR6 hopefully should put that in perspective. Sea level is committed to rise for centuries to millennia due to continuing deep ocean warming and ice sheet melt, and will remain elevated for thousands of years. So regardless of what projections we look to for 2100, it's not a brick wall. Sea level will continue to rise for thousands of years. If you look in the lower right here, we see projections by end of century from IPCC of about 0.5 meter to 1 meter, so up to about 3.5 feet or so. This does not account for the inherent uncertainty of ice sheet instability that we're still trying to get our handles on. And this is why we see upper end projections being considered for the state of California of up to 3 meters or 10 feet. And even the very conservative IPCC body suggests that over 1.5 meters is possible. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for our coast, and why is this relevant? Well, we're soon to have 1 billion people living in the coastal zone globally by the middle of the century. And sea level rise will cause once in a lifetime coastal flooding events to occur annually by 2050 and every day by 2100. And however, the ocean is not a bathtub. And when you consider storms and also the dynamic response of the coast, 3 times more people will be at risk of flooding. Now in California, we're approaching having 30 million residents in coastal counties. And from our assessment of sea level rise and storm flooding over the next century, about 500,000 people and over $200 billion in property will be at risk by 2100. This is over 5% of the state's GDP, to put that in perspective. And these potential impacts are 10 times greater than the worst wildfires and earthquakes in California history. This is assuming that we do absolutely nothing and we make no climate adaptation actions to prevent this from happening. Now you see in the lower right here, we're experiencing high tide flooding, king tide flooding in many communities throughout the state and have been for many decades. Next slide, please. So these impacts should come as no surprise. We've built in harm's way, but it's not just everyday high tide flooding or occasional high tide flooding. The influence of storms with tides is a major factor in driving flooding, which we've experienced for many decades on the California coast. And these impacts will increase as we go through time and sea level rise continues to accelerate. Next slide, please. To assess these impacts, we developed the coastal storm modeling system about a decade ago and been building it out across California. The concept of this approach is to take the latest wind and pressure fields from global climate models and then downscale the waves generated from those wind fields to the regional scale. We bring in storm surge and tides, and then continue to scale finer and finer down to the local level, the beach scale, to transform the waves across the shelf, to include the river flows, to include the long-term response of the cliffs and beach systems, to then make projections of coastal flooding and erosion across the California coast. This is served up in the Our Coast, Our Future viewer, which Maya Hayden will describe here shortly. And this information is also translated into socioeconomic impacts through the HERA tool, the Hazard Exposure Reporting Analytics tool by USGS. I'll have links to these at the end. Next slide, please. And as we built this out across the state, we've worked with dozens of cities and counties to incorporate this information into their hazard plans, including LCPs. We've worked with Caltrans to assess the vulnerability of the transportation infrastructure across the state. We've worked extensively with Coastal Commission staff to evaluate coastal permits, and they've been invaluable, provided invaluable feedback over the years in developing this research. And also this work was used by the California State Legislature as justification for passing this recent $3.7 billion climate resilience spending package. So it's been incorporated in lots of efforts, sea level rise guidance across the state for overland flooding. The next slide, please. But in all this work, and the outreach work, which was led by Juliet Finzi Hart, who was at USGS at the time and now at OPR, we began getting lots and lots of feedback from our stakeholders about other potential hazards. And this is, we're going to talk about for the rest of this discussion, is groundwater emergence and groundwater hazards across the state. This has really been highlighted in places like Miami, which are experiencing high tide flooding from groundwater rising and intercepting the land surface on a daily basis in some neighborhoods. This is not quite as severe as we have here in California, but it really brought to light that we really need to assess the risk of this hazard across the state, along with the overland flood hazards. Next slide, please. So the basic concept is this, which Kelsey already nicely introduced, is that as the water table, as sea level rises, the water table will rise as well. The height of that water table is set by the ocean water level, as well as the geology that the water flows through in the subsurface, and also the recharge, so the rainfall that enters the groundwater system. And so the water table will rise at some rate in sort of along with sea level rise. It can cause inundation and emergence, and also it will shoal, become increasingly shallower along coastal communities and potentially impact a number of infrastructure in those regions, and also saltwater intrusion, so that saltwater wedge can penetrate further landward and be a major hazard, especially for the agricultural industry. Next slide, please. And so to put this in perspective, on the left is a map showing extreme coastal flooding during a storm event in Pacifica by the end of the century. And this is really the first time this particular community sees significant overland flooding. However, on the right-hand side is based on the numerical modeling of the groundwater system led by Kevin Beefus at the University of Arkansas, which shows in warm colors where you have very shallow groundwater currently in the particular region. And click through, please. And so with the same amount of sea level rise you see on the left, the model predicts that you'll have groundwater emergence in this community on a daily basis. So where we're looking at extreme overland flooding, which might happen, say once a century, on the right-hand side, what we show is that the groundwater emergence is going to be a daily factor in this community and needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. And as sea level rises, this potential impact could be much worse. Next slide, please. This is another schematic looking at this issue. So you see the water table there moving from left to right. It's essentially pinned to high water along the coastline. And you see the saline groundwater as well. This is present day conditions. Next slide, please. And as we move forward through time and sea level rises, the shoreline will retreat. that saltwater wedge will move further landward. And in some locations in the upper left here, you're going to have ponding. This is where the water table intercepts the surface and is not draining. And also of note here, you'll see this beach berm does not prevent flooding in back of the beach. And you can imagine this being a seawall or some other form of infrastructure, which the groundwater table essentially ignores. Next slide, please. And this is just a quick overview of the groundwater modeling. We use ModFlow, which is US developed tool that Kevin Beefus led here in its implementation across the state of California for all 1,300 kilometers of coast. It's a subsurface groundwater flow model, so it makes certain assumptions about what the subsurface looks like in terms of the sediment. We modeled 3 different scenarios. One is where you have very fine material in the subsurface, which causes a higher water table, and all the way down to very coarse material like coarse sand and gravel in the subsurface, which causes a lower water table, so it's easier for water to flow through the surface. Because we don't know a lot about the hydrogeology of the California coast, and so we made some assumptions about the range of potential geology in those locations. And I think the key thing to note here also is that instead of taking a worst case scenario, which is where you would simply raise the water table by the amount of sea level rise, the water table ultimately is going to intercept drainages, and that's going to damp the potential for water table rise in some locations. So it's not actually going to be as high as simply linearly raising the water table with sea level rise. This is why we chose this process-based numerical modeling approach to accurately depict the response of the water table due to the topography. Next slide, please. And this is just some examples of what the results look like from across the state, and to show how the topography influences the response of the water table. So here from San Mateo County and San Francisco Bay, you see on the bay side here, present day conditions. The warmer colors are very shallow or emerging water from the water table's current position. And so in these low-lying areas, often fill areas that are almost right at sea level, you see very, very shallow water table, including at San Francisco Airport. And then as you move up terrain, you see that the depth of the water table increases and becomes much less of a concern. This is present day conditions. Now, if you click through, and this is the case for a lot of locations across the state, marine inundation becomes a dominant factor. The depth of the water table doesn't change a lot in most locations because the topography is controlling the flow of water that may intercept the land surface and higher elevations. Next slide, please. And here's another example looking in the Goleta Isla Vista area, kind of showing how topography influences the water table response. And so this is with 1 meter of sea level rise, so about 3.3 feet. And you see the low-lying areas around Goleta Slough and Santa Barbara Airport where the water table will become very, very shallow. These are currently already at risk of overland flooding. Whereas in the high marine terraces around the UC Santa Barbara campus, the groundwater emergence is not an issue and it's much, much deeper. Next slide, please. Similarly here in the Oxnard Plain and the Santa Clara River floodplain, very low lying, very flat, groundwater emergence can become a major issue over the next century. Next slide, please. And again, in low-lying areas like ports and reclaimed estuaries like we have in northern Orange County and the ports of LA and Long Beach have very shallow groundwater today. And by the end of the century, it's become even more of an issue. So it's going to be sort of a compound issue where it's susceptible not only to overland flooding, but the daily impacts of this water table hazard. Next slide, please. So the question is, what are the actual impacts? We know as the water table rises, it can flood into basements, it can inhibit drainage systems, it can damage pipelines and sewage systems, especially septic leach fields. It can undermine infrastructure such as roadbeds and other structures. Next, and you can click through here. But we're not quite sure yet how this translates into impacts. But we know just based on exposure to a high-end sea level rise scenario by the end of the century, that 4 million residents would be exposed to a shallower water table, over $1 trillion in property, and tens of thousands of kilometers of roads and thousands of critical facilities. And now this is 6 to 9 times greater than the exposure from sea level rise and storms from overland flooding. And so while we don't know yet how this translates into impacts, we know that the exposure is commensurate and consistent with what we're seeing from overland flooding and even greater. But there's a lot of research going on now to translate this into what the impacts actually mean. Next slide, please. And so this brings to bear on some of the approaches to coastal adaptation to sea level rise. Commonly, we talk about managed retreat, although something of a bad word, but we are considerate in talking about it and implement it in certain areas. We can elevate structures out of the way. We can block overland flooding using seawalls, and we can also do some green infrastructure and some green solutions as well. However, you can click through here. This does not address the hazard of groundwater. And as Kelsey noted, these seawalls are not going to keep groundwater from penetrating inland. They're not going to keep groundwater from rising. So the question is, are these strategies going to work as we move inland? And what are the actual impacts going to be as we move forward? Something to be determined, but this work, we hope, puts this hazard on the map, and then we can begin to look to solutions to these different hazards across the state. Next slide, please. So thank you for your time. Here's some more information. If you'd like to contact us or to play with this information. And the best way to do that is through the Our Coast, Our Future tool, which Maya Hayden now is going to walk you through, including the newest updates, which feature these groundwater projections. Thank you very much for your time.
Billy, I think Maya was going to play the video next to walk through that tool.
Good morning, and thank you, commissioners, for having us on today. I'm Maya Hayden. I lead our coastal adaptation program at Point Blue Conservation Science, and I'll be providing a demonstration of the newly released Our Coast, Our Future web tool. For those of you unfamiliar with Our Coast, Our Future, or OCOF, it is a partnership led by Point Blue Conservation Science and USGS, and over the last decade has brought resources to understand, visualize, and adapt to sea level rise, coastal storms, and other coastal hazards. It's the primary platform for data visualization of the USGS Cosmos model. There are lots of new features and functions in the updated site, but today I'm just going to be focusing on the groundwater table rise component. So if we go to ourcoastourfuture.org, you'll get to the landing page of the new platform, and it basically has 4 main components. There's a section about the tool and getting started and how to get help. There are case study examples of how the information and the viewer have been used for sea level rise adaptation planning. And there's the science and modeling page, which gives you information about sea level rise projections, the latest for California, more technical information about Cosmos, and what output products are available. And although I'll be focusing today just on the groundwater piece, I just wanted to remind people that we do have the shoreline change and cliff retreat data visualized in the viewer, as well as the surface flooding and derivative products. But the main component of the tool is the hazard map. And on the left-hand side of the viewer, you can choose the scenario topic to look at. So in this case, the flooding output product, and then choose whatever combination of sea level rise and storm frequency that you would like. And you can change these to feet if that is helpful. On the right side is the legend, and there are additional layers that you can add on here as well. So as an example, most people will come to the viewer to look at the flooding in a particular location. So for instance, we can increase the amount of sea level. We can look at that in combination with different storm scenarios and see how flooding in this particular location, and by that I mean surface flooding, might be affected. In addition, now you can look at the groundwater table. So if you select the topic groundwater, you will go to the groundwater data set that Kevin has produced for the whole state. So here you can see not only the marine inundation, so that's surface flooding, but then you can start to basically look at how deep is the water table in certain locations. So these colored regions basically show you the depth to the water table. So you're looking below the surface. The areas in red are places where you might start to see emergent water coming up out of the surface, the ground surface, and then the orange is very shallow groundwater. And so, you know, you can increase the amount of sea level and start to see how not only that surface flooding component comes in, but also how the groundwater table will react as a result of sea level rise. In addition, as was mentioned, the modeling was run with 3 different assumptions of subsurface geology. So you can look at a more permeable condition, which leads to a deeper water table, a moderate, and a less permeable. And those 3 options are available for every sea level rise scenario. So we've also provided some guidance if you hit a question mark, some guidance on which option should I choose, depending on whether you have local knowledge about your local geology and or depth to the groundwater table. Or if you're thinking more in terms of risk tolerance, for instance, if you have particularly critical assets that you're concerned about with potential groundwater impacts, then you might choose the less permeable option of the subsurface geology so that you get the shallowest water table for any given scenario. And with that, thank you very much for your time. We'll take any questions that you have right now, and also please feel free to reach out to us for further information.
That completes their presentation. So I just wanted to thank the team and let anybody know if they have questions. Thanks.
Right. Ms. Ducklow, thank you so much. That was an excellent, excellent presentation. Really so important, really important. I can see there's lots of commissioners who have questions, but first I'm just going to ask, whoops, I'm going to ask if there is any public comment.
Yes, we do have two speakers signed up to speak, Mandy Sackett and Nancy Okada. I'm actually unable to find the Nancy Okada who has signed up to speak. So if you are in the attendees list, Nancy, and able to raise your hand, that would be helpful. Oh, okay, I do see a phone number. Well, we'll start with Mandy Sackett, who is in as a panelist. Mandy, please feel free to unmute yourself and begin.
Thank you.
Hi, Mandy Sackett with Surfrider Foundation. So thanks so much for the time this morning. Many coastal communities contain affluent neighborhoods, but vulnerable populations also live near the coast and will face the risk of more frequent flooding and damage from sea level rise and groundwater rise, as we're hearing this morning. California's low-income communities might be disproportionately impacted, especially by groundwater rise, due to having fewer resources to rely on and to prepare for and respond to and recover from these flood and hazard events. A 2020 report by the city of Alameda identified groundwater rise as a looming and underappreciated hazard, and I think becoming more appreciated and brought to light here thanks to this great work. One major concern is that groundwater rise might contaminate groundwater supplies, undermine building foundations, and then raise the risk of destructive urban flooding. Local governments really need to be analyzing this threat in their vulnerability reports and adding to their vulnerability reports if they're already complete. We really think those should be living documents and then plan and adapt to this threat accordingly. Environmental justice communities in proximity to legacy contamination and industrial sites may be especially impacted because rising groundwater can, as you heard today, mobilize this legacy toxic waste, and the Alameda report really shows that. So we hope the commission will encourage local governments to look into this in their permitting and planning decisions. You know, it really will pose a big threat in the future, and we need to ensure that there are resources available for vulnerable populations, especially to adapt. And I'd also like to just point out that groundwater rise will be an important factor when you're considering the Poseidon Huntington Beach desalination permit later this year. Huntington Beach is known to have a really high groundwater table to begin with, and coastal hazards, including groundwater rise, will impact the proposed Poseidon site. Groundwater rise will also impact and potentially mobilize contaminants from the nearby Ascon landfill site, which is right next to the Poseidon site, and where Poseidon's distribution pipelines would have to basically run immediately adjacent to. And that landfill sites is known to contain heavy metals, harmful chemicals, and all sorts of things that could be mobilized. So we hope that'll be taken into really careful consideration. And just to wrap up, hope the commission will take drastic measures to protect Californians from these threats. And one of the best ways is to avoid siting new development altogether, especially critical infrastructure and hazardous zones. So we're excited to talk about that during the next item. Thank you.
Thank you,
And
Ms. Sack.
our final speaker, thank you. Our final speaker for this item is Nancy Okada, who is on the phone. And Nancy, you should be able to unmute yourself. And
yes, hi.
Hi.
You should be able to hear me. Thank you for letting me comment, and thank you for the presentation. It really does point out that groundwater is something that we can't see, and we really don't know the implications when it is contaminated, as we've learned in so many other instances when we've been dealing with contaminated groundwater in the Central Valley. But I echo Mandy's comments, and I'd ask you to please consider the public health and safety hazards that could come when you site various utilities or desalination plants or other items in the face of sea level rise along the coast. And you really need to consider that the engineering experts will always tell you that they have some new fangled, whether it's a seawall or device that's going to keep the sea from rising. But once again, as you see with the groundwater, and the maps are amazing, it's something that needs to really be taken into consideration, and Mother Nature is much more powerful than we, as we know from Hurricane Ida and New York City, is something that really we have to respect and pay attention to when we locate hazardous or potentially hazardous items anywhere along the coast. So thank you so much for all your diligence and protecting the coast. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Okada. And that's it for the public testimony? Yes?
yes, that is it.
Great, thank you so much. All right, we're going to move to commissioners' questions or comments. First up, we have Commissioner Gold.
Thank you very much. That was a really informative presentation, and it made me think a great deal about a particular issue I know we've been facing in the LA region for a long time, and how much that would get exacerbated. So we have a major seawater intrusion issue in the South Bay, and also down in the Long Beach, San Pedro area, with productive groundwater basins, and it's cost tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to put in seawater intrusion barriers and keep them going and the like. And that was an area that wasn't discussed too much Dr. Barnard, in your presentation. I know it's an area that I know you know well, and so I was just wondering if you might want to reflect there, because in the LA region and in the Monterey Bay region in particular, with sea level rise, so that issue gets exacerbated tremendously. And then the other question I was wondering, which is actually more for commission staff, it might even be legal, is that it's unclear to me sort of what the purview of coastal is on these sorts of issues. I mean, I've never heard anyone really go after seawater intrusion issues for coastal groundwater basins in too much detail before, in the years I've been following, and sort of what we can do and what we can't do. And I also, last thing I just want to say is I appreciate the fact that you're bringing up infrastructure, both stormwater and sewage, because there's a combination of things. One is it gets a heck of a lot more difficult to pump out, especially if you have gravity flow systems. It can really wreak havoc on discharges. And then the other thing is inflow and infiltration, which is you can overwhelm a sewer system pretty tremendously if you have a leaky sewer system that's exacerbated by sea level rise. So I just wanted to leave it at that, but just wanted to get some insight on the seawater intrusion impacts on groundwater, because I obviously brackish groundwater supply, coastal groundwater supply is just so critical for California's drought resilience, as you all know. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Dr. Barnard, if you could address the first question from Commissioner Gold, and then I'll turf it to Ms. Ducklow and Ms. Warren in terms of the second set of questions. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, we're mostly focused here on the superficial aquifer, whereas most of the sort of productive wells are in the confined aquifer. And so that's a whole nother separate issue, which also has obviously been studied in great depth in Southern California because of the need for a productive water supply. So we're mostly looking at that unconfined aquifer at the surface, which is, and mainly the physical hazard, although we are modeling the impact of saltwater intrusion in that superficial aquifer as well. And that is a major factor in a lot of areas, specifically places like the Salinas Valley, for example, like you noted, where that people are seeing those kinds of issues right now. And we're also seeing those sorts of issues at pump stations. I mean, virtually every water treatment plant along the coast is at sea level. And we got lots of reports, and this is kind of what spurred some of this research of these pump stations being rusted, being increasingly more, encountering increasingly more brackish water and having lots of issues with these sort of infrastructure, public infrastructure. So with that, if Kevin would like to comment a little bit more on the deeper confined aquifers and that impact, I'd welcome him to do so if he's available.
I'd be happy to. Just quickly, the idea of the confined and the unconfined aquifers, we're modeling primarily the flooding hazard of the groundwater table. And so this is going to be the shallowest, the closest to the surface aquifer. And for the most part, we don't use that for drinking water. And in Los Angeles, they use one that's thousands of feet deep in that confined system where there's a barrier in between it. And so the pumps that they have there are designed to counter the saltwater intrusion at those great depths. And that aquifer system is relatively disconnected from the aquifers that we were studying in these models.
Okay. Did you have any follow-up questions to what Dr. Beefus or Barnard said, Commissioner Gold?
No, I was just more the clarification question from commission staff on the issue that I brought up, and whether drinking water is something that is, we'd be entertaining in the future, and if so, under what part of the Coastal Act. It's just a new application for me and how I'm sort of thinking about it based on this presentation and some other work I've seen over the years.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Ducklow, Ms. Warren?
I would defer to either Jack or Ms. Warren on the specifics of some of those questions. I think generally speaking, we're at a pretty early phase in really understanding some of these impacts and making sure that we're getting this information into our hazards analyses and other types of analyses. And so mostly right now, we really just want to be understanding those impacts so that we can understand what kinds of adaptation strategies we need to use to address those. But if Louise has other specific answers or Jack.
That was to some degree where I was going to go, that the Coastal Act does require that development is sited and designed to be safe from hazards. And this is another type of hazard that we're talking about here. But in addition, new development needs to be sited where there are adequate services, things like drinking water, to be able to serve those new developments. So I think there are legal bases for addressing both a hazard that was described today and ensuring that there's adequate drinking water available.
I would also just add that under, I think it's 30231 of the Act, talks about the protection of coastal waters, and one of those is the ensuring there's no depletion of groundwater resources. But Mark, I think it's more around the hazards issues that are associated with rising groundwater is the issue that we're primarily focused on. But that rising groundwater will affect, as you say, with the saltwater intrusion, drinking water supplies and how that relates to siting of development, other things like that. So we do have these links, but we also have to rely on the regional and state water boards and not step into their territory. And the Coastal Act lays out pretty clear boundaries there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ainsworth. Next is Commissioner Wilson.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Part of what I'm also seeing and understanding here is that, and I think communities should understand, and it kind of has a nexus to the Santa Barbara issue with regards to LCPs and those sorts of things, that if communities are going to be impacted and have an expectation for response from the state and the citizens of the state to assist as these problems grow, there needs to be some reciprocal responsibility in these processes. And I think that's something we're going to have to grapple with. And we're not bumping up against that, but when these issues are happening and and we have a community that's refused LCP updates and those sorts of things, how is the application for funding to update those infrastructures going to work at the state level? And I think it's an issue we got to be thinking about. The other thing, and I know I've mentioned this before, is, when reading this report, it was just interesting that it sort of defers to this, in terms of highways and roadways, to the statutory obligations to maintain and potentially even expand on those infrastructures, in understanding that it is our current transportation paradigm, which is probably half of climate changes what we're doing right now. I mean, and so here we are trying to protect those very infrastructures to a degree, and without even rethinking about what it means. What does a 12-foot lane really mean? Why do we have to maintain it? So that in understanding these sorts of things, or in highways, more lanes, or in some of these other things in roadways that cannot be abandoned, we're sort of abdicating to this statutory obligation. And I think as an agency and as a state, we should be really, I think, rethinking that and pushing against that. Likewise, there is the obligation of maintaining current service structures in some of these spaces as an expectation, frankly, culturally, that a roadway will always be accessible all the time under all conditions. And I think maybe something we may have learned in this last year and a half is that sometimes things are not accessible all the time. And maybe we can adapt our, matter of fact, look at us right now, right? We're not on the road accessing each other due to extreme conditions, right? And so maybe we really need to be rethinking a lot of what we're protecting and why in these analysis. And I do appreciate that the report called it out as a statutory obligation separate from maybe what we're thinking about or what USGS is thinking about, but we need to pull that back and I think look back at our state agencies to really rethink that. And when I brought up the 12-foot lane, I just, as a side note, the 12-foot lane as a car lane was created by the National Highway system so that they could move tanks. And so now that's why American vehicles are so big, is because they've adapted to a lane so that we can move tanks. And it's basically, now we have these trucks, large vehicles that are machined and have performance standards of sports cars, and they're just cutting through our communities. And us as local decision makers are getting hammered on the safety issues of this. But bringing it back to what we're talking about today, understanding that these expectations, they just keep growing. And it's in conflict with what nature and what climate change is telling us to do. And I think we need to stand back a little bit at some point and really reevaluate that. And likewise, that was me pontificating. This is kind of a question now, which is a lot of what we talked about anthropogenic infrastructure associated with this, but we have, ecosystem infrastructures such as our estuarine systems, which are lifelines for our, there are nurseries for so many of our species, and without them they collapse. And the report does mention the squeeze that's occurring, but will there be a subsequent sort of strategies associated with that? And so I was just kind of wondering where we're going in sort of the next phase and sort of the natural systems infrastructure.
Thank you, Commissioner Wilson. I think Dr. Barnard, if you can respond to Commissioner Wilson's question regarding natural environments.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of research going on now to try to better quantify ecosystem services and how these hazards are going to affect the natural system. It's very easy to talk about dollars and lives, and that makes headlines, and we need to be able to translate ecosystem response in a similar way. Not only the protective services that ecosystems provide in terms of mitigating flood risk, but also the value of the ecosystems themselves and what they provide in terms of a whole variety of factors, including recreational for us, but also just the natural system in general. And then just a quick note on the roadway issue. I think where a lot of work is going now is really to assess the cascading impacts of climate change. So we're just simply looking at exposure analysis. But big questions have arisen, for example, with the mud flows in Montecito when you basically interrupt transportation along an important corridor like 101. What are the cascading effects of that across the community, which are very poorly assessed now? We saw examples in that case where people couldn't get their dialysis, for example. People couldn't get to their jobs. And that's kind of, I think, the next stage of research that a lot of people are pursuing right now, is to try to get to those teleconnections of climate impacts across the system.
And as a follow-up, I see what you're saying about assessing those impacts, but we keep focusing on infrastructural responses to the absolute, as opposed to programmatic responses to how can we make communities more resilient and self-sustaining with maybe differing connectivity expectations that maybe are looking in another direction. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. And I appreciate your thought on that. Not today necessarily, but thanks.
Well, that's all right. Dr. Barnard, do you have anything you wanted to say in response to Commissioner Wilson's statement?
I think if you're talking about like ecosystem solutions and green solutions, there's a lot of work going on there right now. So we're not just building a wall and defending ourselves, but thinking about more practical ways to work with nature to provide those ecosystem services, as well as protection from hazards. there's a lot of work in particular going on in San Francisco Bay right now. Green solutions, looking at flood mitigation from ecosystems and tidal marsh restoration, which has really kind of shifted the focus, I think, from tidal marsh restoration as an ecosystem service to something that's also can provide flood protection. I think that's provided a lot of the sort of the momentum to move a lot of that work forward. So a lot of efforts going on that front, but I think it's very early days. And I agree with you that, you know, we need to have a dual focus. It's not just, you know, dollars and lives. There's a whole suite of other resources out there that need to be considered and protected.
Thank you, Dr. Barnard. Next up is Commissioner Rice.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for the presentation. Really excellent. And I just kind of, I'm still sort of dwelling on one of the initial statements that Patrick, you made with regards to it's, you know, what's been set in motion is irreversible with regards to sea level rise and groundwater intrusion, regardless of how successful we are in terms of drawing down our greenhouse gas emissions. What's been set in motion now, the only question is how fast and how far, but for us in our human terms, in terms of our own lifespans, the impacts are happening right now. And I would say within the next 20 and 30 years, actually in some communities, pretty devastating. So to me, it really speaks again to not just the need for the regional planning, but for the thinking around this isn't about protecting for the next 50 or 100 years. This is about adapting to something that's going to be happening over many hundreds of years, and probably many of the areas in which are not just individual homes exist today, but whole communities exist, aren't going to be probably habitable the same way. And it's really general planning and coming to grips with that. And then with regards to the environmental and the ecosystem impacts, it feels like adaptation more than protection. But it's I think that I just have this image of a big boulder that was, you know, tipped off the side of a mountain, and it's rolling, and there's no stopping it. It's just a matter of how fast does it roll. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Rice. Commissioner Escalante.
Thank you, Vice Chair. And this was a very sobering presentation. You know, I'm trying to sort of manage my climate anxiety, and sometimes when I'm faced with some of these predictions, kind of, you know, throws me back to square one. But obviously, for the sake of my child and our future, I think it's important to all of us to stay hopeful and looking towards solutions. So I really do appreciate sort of peeling back our blinders and looking at the reality and the threat of this, because this is not only sort of, you know, there's two levels of climate impact. There's sort of those who can adapt, who can pick up and maybe cut their losses and move somewhere else, you know, and start from scratch. And then as we saw sort of in the past week, there's those who can't do that, who can't get up and move and run away from these tragedies, whether they're fast moving or slow moving. And, you know, we're not just talking about sort of, you know, millionaires' vacation properties on the bluff tops. We're talking about sort of dense populations that go further inland, you know, if their water tables are affected. And, you know, water is life. I mean, and as in California, our communities are squeezed by wildfires and drought further towards the coast. So all of this to say that I do appreciate us sort of looking at all of this thoroughly, and I do hope that in the next iterations of this, we do also a thorough kind of socioeconomic analysis, because I do think that, you know, as money starts pouring in and interest starts coming in, you know, the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? And I think that we really need to be very intentional about how some of that relief and some of that planning needs to be rolled out, because ultimately those who perish first and who are in the front lines are, you know, our most vulnerable, our seniors, our disabled, our, you know, our infirmed, and of course our low-income workers and our communities of color. So I do hope that, you know, not just looking at it from an environmental justice angle, but from a, you know, socioeconomic angle so that we get the full picture as to the, the level of impacts on people, and then what we can do as decision makers to adapt to that and react to that. So thank you, Patrick.
Dr. Barnard, do you want to respond to Commissioner Escalante's comments, particularly with those additional factors being evaluated in your models?
Sure, yeah. Well, in the HERA tool I mentioned, there's a lot of demographic information there, so you can start diving into some of these environmental justice issues. That's a focus of this administration. So as feds, that's something that we not only want to focus on, we're mandated to focus on it. And now we have the opportunity to dig more into the numbers and really highlight some of those issues with the wealth of information that's available in that tool. And yes, there are a lot of these, disadvantaged communities, vulnerable communities across the state that are particularly vulnerable to this hazard we discussed today. Places like Imperial Beach, like Wilmington in the Port of LA, like East Palo Alto, like West Oakland. And these are communities that, are in harm's way and don't necessarily have the same resources to defend against these hazards. And so I think as we move forward, environmental justice is a major, major concern and topic of focus for USGS and other federal agencies, and obviously at the state level as well. And we have the information to address it. And we're starting to increase bandwidth on that front and to bring in more experts to help us address these problems. And we really look forward to working with the state more as we move forward to really have some more directed approaches to supporting these communities.
Thank you, Dr. Barnard. Such a critically important topic and really a priority for this commission, are the environmental justice and the socioeconomic consequences that are going to reverberate as a result of sea level rise and all of its different components. Next is Commissioner Hart.
Thanks so much, Vice Chair Brownsie. Just a couple questions. First of all, is what we just witnessed, Mr. Barnard, in New York and New Jersey, just watching that happen? I mean, one of the things that I was confused about is how much was that sea level rise? How much was that storm surge? How much was that groundwater? That's question one for you. And then question two for staff is, now that we have this data and we have the tool to show, in addition to sea level rise, groundwater intrusion, and we have our excellent, of course, sea level rise guidance document, will staff plan on incorporating that tool and the estimates provided when we consider developments where groundwater intrusion is an issue, or will that analysis be included in the reports that we get? So that's one for Mr. Barnard and one for whoever wants to respond, staff. Thanks.
Okay, you bet, Commissioner Hart. Mr. Barnard, Dr. Barnard, why don't you start, and then we'll turf it to Jack, to Mr. Ainsworth and Ms. Duck.
Sure. I can't speak in great detail about the flooding in the Northeast and all the causes. Certainly it bears to light the fact that our infrastructure just isn't prepared to deal with multiple storms. And as sea level rise increases and climate change and the climate warms, we're going to see increase in the magnitude and the severity of storms, the frequency of storms as well. And what we saw in the Northeast, we had Hurricane Henri, followed 10 days later by Hurricane Ida. Obviously, it was too much for the infrastructure to bear, whether it's stormwater outflow, infrastructure, sewage plants. I mean, in general, is a really nasty 1-2 punch, which I think is just representative of what we're going to see more in the future. Some of these events, these compounding events, maybe more closely large events like we saw there in the Northeast. It just overwhelms the system, and I think these are kinds of events that we're going to have to plan for as we move forward.
Thank you, Dr. Barnard. Mr. Ainsworth.
Yeah. So on the question of how we're going to use this type of information, this emerging information going forward, and what are we doing now, both in our planning and regulatory program. We are incorporating groundwater hazards as just part of a vulnerability assessment to many hazards that Dr. Barnard talked about the confluence of these hazards, and that's what we're seeing. So we're just kind of scratching the surface on the groundwater rise area, since we didn't, as Kelsey noted, we didn't have a lot of data, and we didn't have this great tool. And now this tool just helps us to expand that analysis, and with regard to specific, permits, it also on a site-specific basis, we're going to be focusing in more closely, and we're already doing this on the groundwater hazards associated with new development. So we are going to be incorporating this. It's always evolving. It's always changing. And so when we talk about the use of the best available science, this is what we're talking about. As we explore and investigate and these hazards, and more new information is coming out, new science is being developed, that has to be incorporated not only into our planning program, but our regulatory program. And so that's why LCPs have to be updated frequently to capture this new science. And that's a concern by some of our local government partners, because they want something more locked in, certainty around this. The one thing about sea level rise and the climate change is there's no certainty. We have no clue what the future will hold, only that it's going to get worse. So that's why we have to continually update our planning documents and our guidance around sea level rise and the effects of climate change going forward. Kelsey, any pearls of wisdom there?
Not too much more. I would just add that, like Jack said, we have considered groundwater. There are places where we've known groundwater could be an issue, for example, around Humboldt Bay. And the really great thing about this tool is it gives us a little bit more of a picture of understanding exactly what those impacts, where those impacts might occur a little bit more than we have in the past.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Ainsworth, Ms. Ducklow. Commissioner Escalante, did you have a follow-up comment, or is your hand just up? Okay.
Sorry, Vice Chair, I forgot to recognize how beautiful this tool is actually, despite the fact that it's based on, catastrophe, but it's really helpful. And I most recently had, I was talking to this crew from Televisa, Mexico's largest network, and they were doing this piece on climate change in the west of the United States. And I just shared with them the link to this tool, because I think, we have the privilege in California or in the West Coast in the United States to have this science. And even if it's not perfect, we're able to create these models that I think are very, very helpful. And, most of the rest of the world, especially the developing world, doesn't have this, So I don't know, Dr. Barnard, if you have any kind of collaborations with any partners south of the border, but maybe they'll be calling you soon, because I think that this is tremendous knowledge especially for nations that are surrounded by oceans. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Escalante. Excellent point about sharing resources. I'm just going to make a couple comments. One is that a couple years ago, there was a sea level rise special hearing by the Assembly, one of the Assembly select committees. And it was comprised of coastal legislators. And it was so interesting because the one speaker, a professor from Berkeley, whose name I don't remember, she was a professor of architecture and something else. She did a presentation on groundwater, and you could see it was that presentation on groundwater that kind of blew everybody's mind, because the legislators to a person said, I knew about sea level rise, the storm surges and the waves, but nobody's ever mentioned groundwater. So it was really kind of a paradigm shift. You could see it happening. And I think that's what makes your work, Dr. Bernard and Dr. Bafus and Dr. Hasten and Dr. Hoover, so incredibly important, because it helps us visualize and understand the complexity of sea level rise. And as Mr. Ainsworth said, it is an evolving issue because climate change is evolving. And I think for us, helping our local government partners and other asset managers visualize and understand the complexity of what their communities are going to face in the near and far future, that the tools that you've put together with your website, with Cosmos, and with the new website on the oceans, what's the name of it? It's OCOF. So I just can't, I guess, state strong enough how critically important that is for not only our staff, but a whole suite of state regulators and officials and so forth to really understand what's at stake here in the state of California. And so for that, I'm deeply grateful to the work that you're doing, and just hope that you will continue to be supported and continue to look at the additional elements of sea level rise, because I think it's this information that's so critically important, because it really will help communities make a decision on what adaptation tools or options really work in their community. Because if you don't account for groundwater rise, it's not going to be a successful adaptation if groundwater is a major contributing factor to flooding in that community. So for those reasons, I can't thank you enough for the work that you do, and know that we put it into practice every month. And so thank you. Thank you very much. So commissioners and staff, great presentation. So I just wanted to see with the commission, it's a little after 12. What I'd like to do, if this is okay with everybody, let's knock out the consent calendar. And then there's 2 consent calendars, a regular consent calendar, and then we'll break for lunch. So that should be around 12:30, and then we can come back at 1:15. And also, just for planning purposes, we're not going to have closed session until Friday. So for commissioners who are looking at their schedule, because we have full days today and tomorrow, staff had indicated, Mr. Ainsworth had indicated we do closed session after the hearing on Friday. And I can see Mr. Ainsworth has his finger up. So yes, sir.
Madam Chair, we have one more item under my ED report, and that's item 6G. That was the overview of the draft critical infrastructure guidance document. And we will be brief. We just want to provide, and this was at the request of the commission, to provide an overview, but also to highlight our draft critical infrastructure guidance document. So continuing on the theme of hazards and everything in infrastructure, Kelsey is going to present this item as well. So I think I would recommend we do this and then break.
Sounds really good. Sorry, it wasn't on my printed agenda. So please proceed.
Go ahead, Kelsey.
All right. Thank you, Jack, and good afternoon now, commissioners. I'm also pleased to be here today to introduce our new draft guidance document, Critical Infrastructure at Risk, Sea Level Rise Planning Guidance for California's Coastal Zone, which was released on August 16th and is now available for public review and comment. The document is a product of a recent NOAA federal grant project of special merit intended to develop innovative projects that improve coastal management programs and address national priorities. The guidance promotes resilient infrastructure and protection of coastal resources by providing local governments, asset managers, and other stakeholders with sea level rise planning and policy information. It also builds on and complements the Commission's sea level rise policy guidance, last updated in 2018, and supports achievement of numerous strategic plan action items, objectives, and goals. Next slide, please. As part of today's introduction, I will discuss some of the early outreach and coordination that went into the development of the guidance, the purpose and scope of the guidance, and a description of the document itself, including some of the key messages. Next slide. So early on in the project, prior to beginning development of the document itself, we released a survey to gather input on the content of the guidance. Specifically, we sought to understand priorities in terms of vulnerabilities to sea level rise and what type of information for sea level rise planning would be most useful to stakeholders. The project development was also guided by a steering committee of internal staff members, including staff with legal, enforcement, engineering, ecology, and district expertise, as well as the sea level rise team. This group was instrumental in determining statewide priorities from a commission perspective and in shaping the Coastal Act policy analysis and model policy language. Next slide. Altogether, we received 90 responses to the survey. About half of the respondents noted that roads in their communities are vulnerable now to coastal hazards, and about a third said the same of storm and wastewater infrastructure. Both wastewater infrastructure and roads were highlighted as priorities to be addressed in the guidance by more than half of respondents. The top 3 most commonly cited topics for what type of information for sea level rise planning would be most useful included more information on developing and implementing phased adaptation approaches, information on adaptation strategies in general, including the pros and cons of different strategies, and guidance on using natural infrastructure and adaptation. In response to these surveys, as well as other internal and external coordination, and because our work was limited by the federal grant and available time, we chose to focus on transportation infrastructure and water infrastructure, including highways, local roads, rail, wastewater, stormwater, and water supply assets. This focus is also reflective of the types of projects the Commission most commonly sees. Although the draft guidance doesn't discuss other infrastructure types, we believe that the information recommendations could translate to other assets that share similar characteristics, which I'll touch on in just a moment. Next slide. Since this document focuses on transportation and water infrastructure, Caltrans and the state and regional water resources control boards were key partners in developing those respective guidance topics. A larger group of state agencies, including those shown here, as well as local government partners, including the Commission's local government working group, reviewed or offered comments on early iterations of the draft guidance. Next slide. As I mentioned at the top of the presentation, the overall goal of the guidance is to promote resilient coastal infrastructure and protection of coastal resources by providing policy and planning information to help inform sea level rise adaptation decisions that are consistent with the Coastal Act. As with other sea level rise guidance the Commission has provided, this draft guidance provides interpretive guidelines rather than any new regulations and should be read as policy options and topics to consider rather than a checklist of items that must be addressed. It should also be noted that not everything in this guidance will be applicable or relevant to all users. The document provides a starting point and example policy language that can be modified, but does not negate the need for coordination with Commission staff and other stakeholders. Next slide. The document itself is split up into the chapters you see here, with sections on sea level rise planning background information, key challenges and opportunities for adaptation planning for critical infrastructure in particular, and detailed information on transportation and water infrastructure. The guidance also contains appendices with more information on key topics such as nature-based adaptation, case studies, and notably a section on example policy language that can be integrated into new or updated LCPs. Next slide. Going into a bit more detail, Chapter 3 describes the unique challenges of sea level rise planning for critical infrastructure. Although the process is similar in that it includes assessing vulnerabilities and identifying adaptation options, 2 main facets of critical infrastructure, its purpose and role in our communities, and the physical characteristics of these assets add complexity to adaptation planning and make it substantively different than planning for residential, commercial, or other types of development. As described in this chapter, critical infrastructure provides benefits for the public at large, serving a variety of necessary and practical functions in communities, the loss of which could have potentially damaging social, economic, political, and public health consequences. Further, critical infrastructure is typically much larger than other types of development, includes components that extend over large areas and cross multiple jurisdictional boundaries, and is often comprised of interconnected systems in which vulnerabilities could result in cascading impacts. Taken together, these factors magnify the consequences of inaction while at the same time increasing the scale, complexity, time, and costs associated with adaptation planning. Next slide. Building on this discussion, Chapter 4 discusses 5 key topics that should be considered to address the unique challenges of planning for critical infrastructure and to successfully develop practical and implementable solutions on a local and regional scale that ensure equity among coastal communities. These include coordinated planning, including by working with nearby jurisdictions and regional climate collaboratives, and aligning planning documents and other frameworks such as joint powers authorities and special districts, addressing environmental justice concerns through dedicated outreach and engagement, and by completing alternatives analyses that consider the equitable distribution of environmental benefits and burdens, developing phased adaptation approaches, which I'll talk more about on the next slide, evaluating the full life cycle costs and benefits of different adaptation strategies and prioritizing funding for strategies that help to avoid hazardous areas, and identifying opportunities to expand the use of nature-based adaptation strategies. Each of these topics is described more thoroughly in Chapter 4, and each includes its own set of recommendations. In the interest of time, I won't run through them all now, but as an example, if you go to the next slide, this slide shows the recommendations associated with phased adaptation. Go back. Back one slide, please. There, thanks. This slide shows the recommendations associated with phased adaptation, which involves developing and implementing phased adaptation strategies that maintain essential functions while providing time for planning for a long-term approach. The recommendations include consideration of the long-term scenarios of sea level rise, defining the time periods over which specific strategies will work, and implementing strategies through LCP policies that are updated at appropriate intervals. The guidance also encourages phased adaptation to address the need to prioritize the most vulnerable infrastructure while considering the necessity for network systems to work together, which is key for ensuring the resilience of critical infrastructure over time. Next slide. Continuing on, chapters 5 and 6 discuss transportation and water infrastructure respectively, specifically touching on highways, rail, wastewater, stormwater, and water supply infrastructure. Each chapter includes a brief discussion of statewide vulnerabilities, the relevant regulatory and governance frameworks, and more specific adaptation considerations for each type of critical infrastructure. Next slide. In addition to the main body of the document, the guidance includes a number of appendices that provide additional detailed information on topics like relevant Coastal Act policies, sea level rise planning, statewide infrastructure vulnerabilities, examples of critical infrastructure adaptation projects that have already been undertaken, nature-based adaptation strategies, the cost savings associated with proactive adaptation, and transportation planning. Next slide. Notably, Appendix B includes example policy language that can be used when developing new or updated LCPs to help implement the recommendations in the critical infrastructure guidance. The model policies are split up between transportation policies and water infrastructure policies and cover common topics like planning processes, best available science, and appropriate hazards analyses, siting and design of new infrastructure, and implementing specific adaptation strategies. The example language also covers specific topic areas like environmental justice, Scenic Highway 1, and groundwater change. I want to reiterate that the model policies are offered as a tool that local governments may choose to use as a starting point from which to make edits or otherwise develop policies that are appropriate for local conditions and priorities. They are not a checklist of items the Coastal Commission would expect to see in every LCP. The model policies could be rewritten in any number of ways to account for specific goals or to implement other initiatives, provided that they are still consistent with the Coastal Act. And next slide. As I mentioned earlier, the draft is out now for public review. A link to the document can be found in the highlights section on the home page of the Commission's website, as well as on the agenda for this item. We are requesting that comments be returned by September 24th. And with that, we are happy to answer any questions at this time.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ducklow. That was an excellent presentation on really an excellent report. Are there any public commenters on this item?
Yes, we have 3 speakers for this item.
Okay, please proceed. Thank you.
Okay, we have Mandy Sackett, who will be followed by Laura Walsh, followed by Melinda Cotton. Mandy Sackett, it is now your turn to speak.
Hi, Mandy Sackett on behalf of the Surfrider Foundation, the Environmental Action Committee of Marin County, and the California Coastal Protection Network. We really appreciate staff for releasing this excellent guidance with climate change and sea level rise projections increasing all the time, and the stark picture painted by the recent 6th IPCC climate change report, it's clear that planning for critical infrastructure resilience must be an immediate priority. The California coastline is lined with stormwater and wastewater infrastructure, power plants, hazardous waste sites, roads, and other facilities. And we have this narrow window of opportunity now to proactively plan and relocate as much as we can away from the coastal hazard zones in order to preserve our coasts, our beaches, and our waves. This guidance helps municipalities plan in a way that protects our coastline and recreational opportunities at the beach, as well as our coastal economy and our way of life here in California. So first, we'd like to just express our appreciation that the draft guidance stresses the importance of analyzing the extreme risk scenario, 10 feet or more of sea level rise by 2100. This is essential for communities to have this understanding of how we would respond under this enormously disastrous scenario. We also appreciate that the document considers realistic environmental justice impacts to communities, as well as the need to implement more nature-based strategies. We'd like to take this opportunity to ask staff to more clearly emphasize the need to avoid siting critical infrastructure in coastal hazard zones. We wouldn't put a power plant on a fault line, and the commissions should feel comfortable in explicitly stating that the sources of California's power and water, for example, cannot be located in a flood zone. And we'd also like to express with some caution with regards to the phased adaptation approach that's outlined in the document. It specifically expresses understanding the potential need to rely on shoreline armoring as an interim approach to management. And Surfrider knows from decades of experience that once shoreline armoring is in place, it's rarely removed. And as sea levels rise, it becomes more and more difficult to imagine how these seawalls and armoring would be removed as the coast disappears. And then finally, support staff in further updating the document to encourage local governments to evaluate potential secondary environmental justice implications associated with groundwater rise and legacy contamination. As I mentioned, desalination plants like Poseidon, for instance, should be proactively planning and identifying areas of potential contamination and managing the impact to communities around them. The end game in California must be managed retreat, otherwise we'll be stuck in disaster response mode with unmanaged retreat, and failing to plan is planning to fail. So citing critical infrastructure with coastal hazard zone, within coastal hazard zone, to perpetuate maladaptive development patterns. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And next is Laura Walsh. Laura, it is now your turn. Oh, hello.
Good morning. It sounds like you can hear me. My name is Laura Walsh, and I'm the policy coordinator for the Surfrider Foundation San Diego County chapter. There's already been some really great discussion about sea level rise planning today, so I'll be super brief, but I just wanted to paint a picture of how this kind of guidance is important to us regionally. According to California's 4th climate assessment, examples of vulnerable infrastructure can be found all across our county. In SDG&E's electrical infrastructure around San Diego Bay, the Port of San Diego's waterfront property, Highway 101, the coastal rail corridor in Del Mar, and Naval Base Coronado, just to name a few well-known examples. While sea level rise presents many challenges, particularly in the context of private property, every city in San Diego and every member of the public, whether they own a coastal home or not, and even whether or not they enjoy the coast, benefits from a thoughtful response to public infrastructure management. Responsible management will keep the lights on and the tap water running. So with that, I just want to express support for the document. I'm echoing Mandy in supporting the commission in taking a strong stance on the need to explicitly and proactively respond to sea level rise, and to reiterate the point about phased adaptation approaches being a dangerous concept in the context of shoreline armoring as an interim solution. Even now, we still have some chance to be proactive about managing our retreat from the coastline, and we see cities like Del Mar formally rejecting this option just completely. So there's very little clarity around how armoring solutions will suddenly lead to adaptive management, and yet decades of history and experience to tell us that armoring instead will protect private property and other property while eroding public beaches and blocking coastal access. And like we learned today about groundwater, these solutions with these huge high externalities may not even result in adequate protection for infrastructure. So just appreciate the commission in embarking on this effort and agendizing it today, and look forward to addressing these tough challenges involved in this update as your staff continues to work on this document. Thanks so much.
Thank you. And our final speaker is Melinda Cotton. Melinda, you may now unmute yourself and please speak.
All right, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. My name is Melinda Cotton. I live in Belmont Shore in Long Beach, just 2 blocks from the ocean. I live in a 100-year-old house, and so we are built on wetlands, and if you dig a foot into the ground on our property, you already find the groundwater. You find seashells. We are on the very forefront of what you're discussing today. I'd like to thank staff and Dr. Barnard for their excellent presentation. I'm speaking to you to note the irony that we're talking about protecting existing vital infrastructure at the same time. Just 10 blocks from my house on the beach in Belmont Shore, the commission has approved constructing a Belmont Beach aquatic complex. So this is a complex of swimming pools and diving that could be put elsewhere in Long Beach, but it has been approved to be on the beach. And this beach is already subject to earthquake hazard. That's why the old pool was torn down. It's subject to liquefaction, to groundwater. The sea is already at high tide, rising within about 50 feet or less of the plot where this will be built. The aquatic complex is going to cost $100 million or more. The money will come in large part out of Tideland oil funds that the city gets. And that money could be used for our adaptation to climate change, to move infrastructure, to do all the things that are necessary. I can only point out the irony, and please, staff, Dr. Barnard, I'd love to speak with you, show you the site, and discuss what's going on. The staff has rightly put 18 conditions on the property, and the very last condition is that if the surf rises to the plinth too close, this will have to be torn down. So this is something that is going to be built. Apparently, the city is very anxious to do that. If it is built, it will at some point in the not too distant future be torn down. In the meantime, it will take over beach that is now used by visitors who come from inland cities and inland parts of our city to enjoy the beach. So I simply ask for your attention to this. It's coming up on the agenda later today, and it's very important to look at this closely as it moves forward. And thank you for letting me have time to comment.
Thank you, Ms. Cotton. Any commissioners have any comments or questions on the infrastructure report? Okay, Commissioner Wilson.
Yeah, just an embarrassing apology that some of my comments, I thought when the last person was presenting was on this report. I apologize for the confusion. So Kelsey, you can take those comments. You don't have to respond to them whatsoever, but consume them as if they were to this report. I apologize for that.
No worries, no worries. Hey, I didn't even have the item on my my written agenda. So, and I've spent so much time on this critical infrastructure report, which I just want to say quickly, I mean, this is truly an excellent, excellent report. I really got to shout out the commission staff, everybody who was involved in this. I mean, just really top-notch work as a guidebook, as a source book for local governments, for state legislators, for policymakers, for sister agencies, and really, in my mind, for the communities, the coastal communities, because it's written in such a way that the general reader can read through it and understand and educate themselves of on these important issues that are going to be facing their community and that they need to engage with their community members, different interest groups in the local governments. But the bottom line is so much time and attention was paid to making this comprehensive, and really, I think, as guidance, really a guidebook to try to deconstruct for folks the challenges around sea level rise and critical infrastructure. So I really can't say enough. And so I'll just stop talking because I could go on. But anyway, thank you for that excellent, excellent presentation. And so members, it's 12:45. Let's come back at 1:30. And if anybody doesn't have anything else to say at this point, enjoy your lunch.